Welcome to redheart.com. In this tutorial, I'm going to demonstrate how to knit the Basketweave scarf. This is a free, amazing pattern that's available at redheart.com, and you can download your free pattern directly from the website. My name is Brittany, and I teach over at B.Hooked Knitting. And I'm super excited to have the opportunity to teach you how to knit this scarf. It's a really great pattern for knitters of all levels. Well, go ahead and download your free pattern, gather your supplies, and let's dive in. To begin our scarves, you're going to need to get your knitting needles ready. I'm going to be using circular knitting needles because I find that these are just a little bit easier to work on than straights. That's just a personal preference. So what I have here is, I believe, a 29-inch circular needle, which is way longer than I actually need. And of course, you're going to need your Super Saver Ombre. Now I'm going to demonstrate the long tail cast on, and as the name implies, you need a long tail in order to work this. Now we're going to cast on 40 stitches, so you'll just want to leave yourself a couple of feet. I normally just stick to the side of, having more rather than having too little. Then you have to rip out and start over. So once you do that, you'll have your tail on one side, your working yarn coming from the other, and you'll drape that over your knitting needle and just secure that with your finger. And you want to insert your index and your thumb in between those two strands and then just secure it down at the bottom. Now I will go a little bit quicker in this demonstration. I do have a slower tutorial on the long tail cast on. You can find that at knitting.bhookedcrochet.com/longtail. That's going to be a very beginner friendly for this cast on method. Now, as I said before, we're going to cast on 40 stitches for this scarf. And honestly, you can use any cast on method that you're comfortable with. I personally just like using the long tail cast on, so that's why I'm demonstrating that here. But if you have another one that you're more comfortable or more familiar with, then obviously feel free to cast on however you like. The main goal here is that we have 40 stitches on our needle at the end. Once you have all 40 stitches cast on your needles, we're going to begin the basket weave pattern. And as you've probably seen with the written instructions, this has a 12-row pattern repeat. So we're going to be repeating the same 12 rows over and over until our scarf measures about 90 inches long is what the pattern indicates. Or, you can ad-lib a little bit if you want it longer or shorter, then, you can adjust as you need. Now I mentioned that this has a 12-row pattern repeat. We're going to go over all 12 rows in this tutorial, and just know that there are a couple of rows that are repeated. You'll actually see that these are grouped into threes. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that means as we go on. Now first, let's begin with row number 1. For row 1, we're going to begin by knitting the first 3 stitches. Now we're going to begin the pattern repeat for this row. What we're going to repeat is just a sequence of 4 stitches. We're going to purl 2, and then we'll knit 2. And we're going to repeat that until we come to the end of the row, the last stitch we're going to knit, and we're just going to repeat this sequence. Well, let's talk about these stitches, just in case the knitting is new to you, you're not familiar with knitting and purling. Obviously, if you are, continue with that pattern repeat. We're going to slow things down a bit so you can see how to knit and how to purl. So what I have here is I am working in the continental knitting style. So that means that I have the working yarn in my non-dominant hand, and you'll find that I switch back and forth pretty regularly. I'm comfortable with both. I find that continental knitting is typically easier for people who crochet first and then they transfer over to knitting. So that's what I'm demonstrating here. When you're going to do the continental purl, well, anytime you purl, you need to have your working yarn in front. So I'm just taking my 2 fingers and pushing it out of the way. And then you'll just insert your needle into the first stitch from back to front. And then you'll allow that working yarn to wrap around the tip and work it off your needle. So there we made 1 purl. We need to have 2 for our sequence. So I'm going to pull that forward again, insert my needle purlwise, and work that off. Now anytime you're knitting, you want to have your working yarn coming from the back. So back here, I'm just holding it out of the way. You'll insert your needle into the stitch from front to back. Then you'll just grab the working yarn and pull it through and knit your second stitch. Okay? So now we're just going to repeat that. We will purl 2 and knit 2 all the way to the end of the row. We'll stop at the very end on the last stitch we're going to knit. Now I'm down to my last 3 stitches. The last 2 stitches that I made were purls. And I do want to talk about that a little bit too, because if you ever need to put this project down or if you get distracted, you're going to need to know what a knit and what a purl looks like in order to figure out where you are in the pattern. So anytime you see a stitch where you have 2 bars or you have 1 bar on each stitch, so 2 because I have 2 stitches here. Purls have these little bars around them. So that's how you know you're looking at a purl. When you look at knits, so these 2 are knits. Knits have V's. Now you kind of have to pull it down a little bit to see it on the first row, but you can see the V right there, and that's how you know that's a knit. So purls have bars, knits have V's. And now I'm down to my last 3. I just had 2 knits, so I'm continuing to work in the pattern as it says. We need to work in pattern until the very last stitch. So I'm just continuing on. And then it says to knit the last stitch. So I'm just going to knit the last stitch. And that's going to finish up row 1. Now when you're working with knitting, your first couple of rows are always going to look really messy. It was one of the things I used to do as a beginner. I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, so I would look back and see, man, these stitches are kind of wobbly, they look uneven, and they don't really look that great. So I would rip out and I would start over, and I was really frustrated all the time because, I always had messy looking work here at the end. And what I found is that it just happens. So your first few rows are always going to be a little bit messier looking, but it will straighten itself out. So now we're going to move on to row number 2. You can see I've just turned my work here, and we're going to follow along with row number 2. So row 2 is the exact opposite of row 1. This time we're going to begin with 3 purls. And then our repeat is going to be knit 2, purl 2. So again, exact opposite. And what you'll notice is we are maintaining the same stitch pattern. So that's how we're sort of creating this basket weave. Even though the knits and the purls are opposite in the pattern, what we're finding is that we are purling the purls and we're knitting the knits. So I knit 2, now purl 2, knit 2, and purl 2. Now we're going to repeat that until we get to the last stitch. When you make it to the last stitch, we're going to purl that last stitch. And that will finish up row 2. So now what we're going to do is shuffle back to the repeat for row 1. So if you'll look at your pattern, you'll notice that rows 1, 3, and 5 are all the same pattern, and 2, 4, and 6 are all the same. So for row 3, we just need to turn our work, and we're going to work the same pattern that we did for row 1. So just a little reminder of that, we're going to knit the first 3 stitches, and then we're going to start our repeat. So purl 2, and knit 2. Then we'll repeat that, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, knit 2. We'll do that till we get to the last stitch. And when we get to the last stitch, we're going to knit. So now you can start to see a little bit of the pattern emerge. Basically, all we have here is a 2x2 rib. We're just going to turn our work and pick up on row 4, which is the same as row 2. So that means we are going to begin with 3 purls, and then we'll start our pattern with knit 2, and purl 2. And we'll repeat that to the last stitch. We'll purl the last stitch. And we're going to purl the last stitch. Now that finishes up row 4. We're just going to repeat this a couple more times. We're going to jump back to row 1. Okay, so that's going to be our repeat for row 5. We're going to start by knitting the first 3 stitches. And then we'll start off our repeat with purl 2. And then knit 2. Repeat that to the end of your row and you'll knit the last stitch. Now moving on to row 6, we're going to repeat our second row again. So this is going to be the last little bit in this repeated section, and we're going to try something new. So this time we want to purl the first 3. And we'll start our repeat with 2 knits and then 2 purls. We'll repeat that till we reach the end of the row, and on the last stitch we're going to purl. So what we've done now is we have created half of the entire pattern repeat for the basket weave stitch that we're using for this scarf. So rows 1 through 6 is what we've covered already, and we're using the same 2, just, working them back and forth. Well, we're going to do that for the last 6 rows too. Starting with row 7, what we want to do is knit the first stitch, and then we're going to start our stitch repeat with 2 purls. So purl 2, and then we'll knit 2. Now if you pay attention, you can see that we're no longer, knitting knits and purling purls. We're switching things over, and that's going to create the basket weave. So we will repeat the little pattern here, so purl 2, knit 2, until we get to the last 3 stitches. When you've made it to the last 3 stitches, we're going to purl 2, and then we'll knit the last stitch. So that completes row 7. We're going to move on to row 8. To begin row 8, we're going to purl the first stitch, and then we're going to knit 2, and purl 2. And just like always, we'll repeat those 4 stitches until we get to the last 3. Now on the last 3 stitches, we are going to knit 2, and purl the last stitch. Now that finishes up row number 8. We're going to just flip our work and pick up on row 9, which is a repeat of row 7. We're going to knit the first stitch, and then begin our stitch pattern repeat with purl 2, and then knit 2, purl 2, and repeat that to the last 3 stitches. And when you get to the last 3, you will purl 2, and knit the last stitch. So that finishes up row 9. We'll move on to row 10, which is a repeat from row 8. So we are going to purl the first stitch, and we'll start our repeat with 2 knits, and then 2 purls. And we'll repeat those 4 stitches to the last 3. When you get to the last 3 stitches, we'll knit 2 and we'll purl the last. Now moving along to row 11, we are going to knit the first stitch, and we'll begin our repeat by purling 2, and knitting 2. So once again, this is just a repeat from row 7. And when you get to the last 3 stitches on this row, you're going to purl 2 and then knit the last stitch. So row number 12 is the final row in our pattern repeat. We are going to begin with a purl, and then knit 2 and purl 2. We're going to repeat these 4 stitches until we get to the last 3. And on the last 3, we're going to knit 2 and purl the last. At the end of row 12 and the last row in our pattern repeat, our scarves now look something like this. So you can sort of see how this basket weave pattern comes together. So we have, kind of a 2x2 ribbing going on in the first section, and then all we did was shift that over so that, the ribs occur in between each other. So we have the knit side here and the purl side directly below it. Now that's a visual cue for you to sort of keep track of the pattern while you're knitting this, because that's really one of the most difficult parts of a pattern like this, is keeping track of what row you're on. And there's a couple of tools that are available that I would recommend. You can get row counters. You can download a free app on your phone. If you just go to the App Store and search for Knitting Row Counter, you'll find a couple of different options there. And of course, they have row counters that you can buy at your craft stores. And these are usually something that will either clip onto your needle if you're using straights, or you can wear it on your finger. And you'll just click and keep track at the end of every single row. Now, I'm sure once you get through a few of these repeats, you'll just be able to look at it and know exactly what to do next. So that's sort of the goal here, but probably for the first few repeats, you're going to need to keep track of where you are. Now, with that being said, what we've covered here is the pattern repeat, and we need to repeat this section over and over until our scarf measures about 90 inches long. Once you do that, then come back to the video and we'll talk about binding off, because we do want to make sure that we bind off in pattern, and I will demonstrate that and we'll complete our scarves. Once you have the length of your scarf knitted up, then we're ready to bind off, and I recommend that you stop once you have finished up your section where you start with 3 knits. So where we have 3 knits and then we start our purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, knit 2. That's where I'm going to demonstrate how to bind off. You could do so at another place if you needed to, if you just wanted to shorten or lengthen the scarf rather than what the pattern indicates. The main thing that you want to keep in mind is that you are binding off in pattern. So since I have 3 knit stitches at the very beginning, that's what I want to start out with. So whenever we bind off, we're always going to work 2 stitches, and in this case I'm going to knit 2 stitches because that is what I have to work with here. So I have knits, I'm just knitting the knits. Once you have 2 stitches worked, then you'll just pass the first one over the tip of the needle. It's going to work over that last stitch and bind off. Now in looking at the next stitch, it's a knit as well, so I'm going to knit that next stitch, pass over the last one. Now looking at the next stitch, I have a purl, so I want to purl that stitch, and then I'll pass the last stitch over. So the next stitch is a purl, so I'm going to purl that stitch, and then pass the last stitch over. Now the next 2 are knits, so I'm just going to knit the next stitch, pass the last one over. And that's our repeat. We just want to repeat that to the end of the row, and our scarf will just about be finished. When you've finished binding off, then all you need to do is trim your working yarn, and pull the tail through the loop that remains on your needle. Now at this point it's just finishing touches that we need to do. Of course you'll need to weave in your ends. And one other little finishing technique that I like to use for my projects is wet blocking. So you can see that, this pattern actually looks really great the way it is. There's no curling or rolling or anything like that, which is really awesome. But, you can always benefit from wet blocking, relaxing the fibers, stretching them out. It's going to make the pattern a little bit more uniform. If there were any areas within the stitching where, maybe your tension was a little different, you got distracted or anything like that, to wet block it, all you'll need to do is pin it down on a water-safe surface, just using regular sewing pins. You'll saturate the entire thing with water, and when you pin it, just sort of stretch it out and then let it dry overnight. And then, I think you'll really see a really big impact in how the pattern looks after you've wet blocked. That wraps up our tutorial on the Basketweave scarf, a free pattern that's available at redheart.com. I want to say a big thanks to Red Heart for allowing me the opportunity to teach you how to knit this really amazing pattern. I would love to see your scarves. Super Saver Ombre is an amazing yarn. There's a lot of really great colorways, and I'm anxious to see how everyone else's scarves knit up, because it's going to knit up a little bit different for every person. So you can share this with me on my social media channels. You can find me at B.Hooked Knitting on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and I would love to see your work. Thank you so much, guys. I look forward to serving you in the next episode of B.Hooked Knitting.